Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Wake Up with Ashland. My name is Cameron Walpole. I am the manager of tours and education here at Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate. Wake Up with Ashland is sponsored by the Dupree Mutual Funds. We're really thankful for their sponsorship as we've been able to offer programming on Facebook Live all throughout the pandemic. Today we have a really special guest. This is a curatorial assistant, a volunteer docent, and a board member. Her name is Sue Andrew. You've likely, if you've been watching us, you've probably seen her in the comments. Sue is incredibly involved here at Ashland. She's very knowledgeable about this history. She's done a lot of research and helped in the development of several tours and exhibits here at Ashland and beyond, even at the horse park. There was an exhibit a few years ago about Henry Clay. So I'm going to turn it over to Sue, who's going to be talking about yet another woman of Ashland. We're celebrating the women of Ashland this month with the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. So we're going to be talking about Josephine Russell Erwin Clay. Josephine is a remarkable figure. She kind of bridges a generation between women who didn't have a whole lot of rights and then women like Madeline McDowell Breckinridge who fought for the right to vote. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sue. Let me see here. Okay, Sue, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. I am so pleased to have this opportunity to talk about this particular lady, Josephine. She's one of my personal favorites on our Women's Voices tour because, as Cameron said, she certainly made her voice heard in a man's world. So, would we have known so much about this remarkable lady if it hadn't been for the ice storm here in Lexington in 2003? Because her great-grandson, Clay Simpson, was stuck in his mother's house here, unable to get out, and in a box he discovered his great-grandmother's scrapbook. He became so intrigued with her life story through everything that was in that scrapbook. He started to do more research, and 2 years later, he would publish a book, The Pioneer Horsewoman of the Bluegrass. And that actually was all part of what Cameron said earlier, our big exhibit at the horse park on the family members that were very much involved in the horse industry. Now, her father, William Russell, would actually call her Jo. She was quite a tomboy, often with her brothers out doing boyish things. But he would spell it J-O-E. It would later be shortened to J-O, which is the normal abbreviation for the girl's name of Josephine. But William Russell was a friend and colleague of Henry Clay. And for some time they lived here at Ashland. They lived here in Lexington. And they would be invited to Ashland to have dinner. When they were here, sitting around the table, the young 7-year-old Josephine would see, across the table from her, the Clay's grandson, Eugene Erwin, and also the Clay's younger son, John Morrison. Those two would become future husbands of this young girl. And there is another amusing story from that dinner, insofar as they obviously served globe artichokes for the meal. And Jo didn't like them, and that became fairly obvious to Henry Clay because he could see her pushing it around her plate. So, seeing her predicament, he would whisk the offending object off her plate and save her any more embarrassment by eating it himself. He would also make an entry in her scrapbook, and that scrapbook still exists today, and it is at UK Special Collections. Now, her father, William Russell, was restless, it appears, always looking for the next adventure, always wanting to move around. And for the young girl, Jo, it would be something that she would do with him, because she would actually travel to Mexico with him. Then they would end up in California, and the whole family would move there. And when Jo was 16, she would meet and become engaged to a young Eugene Erwin, the grandson of the Clays. They would marry the following year when she was 17. They would then decide to move to Independence, Missouri. Ideas of opening up a business to supply to the caravans of the gold rush, all those people that were trying to get to different gold sites. They would also start their family. They would have 3 daughters. Lucretia was the eldest, but she was called Lula. The second was Zeynep, named for her mother, and she was called Nettie. The third was Mary, and she was called Mamie. The family were very happy in independence, but like many families, their life was totally shattered by the Civil War. Joe was very much opposed to the Confederate cause and certainly didn't want Eugene to be involved in it in any way. And he promised not to, but he would. He would enlist, he would be made a lieutenant colonel in the Confederates' 6th Missouri Infantry Regiment, and he would go off to fight. Joe would get news that he was injured. In fact, he'd been injured in the Battle of Corinth in the foot, and he was in hospital. So showing her fearless spirit, Joe would hire a wagon. She would take her eldest daughter Lula with her. She'd leave the other 2 with her mother, who was living with her, and off they would set. She would be reunited with her husband, and she would stay by his side through most of the Vicksburg campaign. But he would get off his sick bed because he hadn't been well. He would get off his sick bed and he would lead a charge over the parapets at Vicksburg, only to be shot through the heart, killed instantly, and he was dead at 32. She would then be distraught, obviously, and wanted to get back home to Independence, Missouri. But she had to get through Union lines. She also had the responsibility of her young daughter, but she was also pregnant. And so Grant would hear of her predicament, knowing that she was carrying Henry Clay's great-grandchild. He would give her a pass. And because he knew she only had Confederate money, he would also give her a $50 note. He would also extend his hand to her. She would refuse to shake it. She could not shake the hand of the man that she felt was responsible for the death of her husband. Now, on her way home, she would secretly sew the battle flag of the 6th Missouri, her husband's regiment, into her petticoats. And somehow she would also hide his blood-stained uniform from the battle. And these things all exist, and you can see where the bullet hole was, right in his heart. A family member, maybe Josephine, I don't know, has put a red handkerchief. These things have been on display, and I believe they still belong to the family, but Eric might be able to confirm that. So now she is back in Missouri, but Missouri is a Union state. She's a Confederate widow. They were being asked to swear an oath to the Union. Life was very difficult for her. She was having financial difficulties. She had 3 young children to look after, and sadly, she loses that baby she's carrying, that she named Eugenia for her husband. It was a little girl. She only lived a few hours. It seems to have changed Josephine's attitude to life, all these sad experiences that she had, because it appears that she would become totally self-reliant and would be determined that she and her family would survive, and that would be the most important thing in her life. In fact, a later quote that we have from Josephine would really sum that up, insofar as she would say that I will always do my best, I will rely absolutely only on myself, I will paddle my own canoe, and if that craft goes down, I will sink with it. So that really sums up the whole of Josephine's independent spirit. But she would actually write to John, the youngest son of the Clays, who was living at Ashland on Tate's Creek Pike with his mother, Lucretia. And she would call him Uncle John because he was her uncle by marriage. He would sign himself in his letters to her, Uncle John. And at that time, he would actually invite her to come and stay with them. But it appears that she waited 2 years until the end of the Civil War before she would actually come to Lexington. By then, of course, Lucretia, his mother, is dead and John is on his own. Ostensibly, she comes to claim for her children money left in Lucretia's will. But it appears that she moved into Ashland on Tate's Creek Pike and started to become sort of the housekeeper for John, looking after him. People started to talk because there were two men and women in a house on their own. It was not considered proper, even though John was 43 and Josephine was a widow of 30. So how did John rectify that? Is he would marry Josephine. Now, it's not a very romantic piece that he puts in his journal, because what he says was he gets up around 4:30, he gets someone to help him grind some meal, he has his breakfast, he pops into town to get a marriage license, he marries Jo about 8:30, and then he talks about the weather. So it's not the most romantic start, but it appears they had a very good, strong relationship and a very good, strong marriage. And as you can see from the photograph of the two of them, it does make you think that Josephine was very much in charge. Now, it does appear that she was very interested in horses herself, and so she would help John with his Ashland stock farm. It also appears that John's excessive drinking would stop at home, but not on the track. So the way that she remedied that was that she would say that they would not race horses anymore, they would just breed them. But luckily, before John was stopped going to the track, he would win these purses that we have hanging on the wall here at Ashland. Now, these were won by John, kept by Josephine's descendants, and we are very lucky to have 5 of these purses. 2 are beyond conservation. 1 hangs in the horse park because they don't have their own, but many of you might, when you've been to the track, seen at the top of each race, it says the purse is, and it's typically an amount of money. But in John's day, it was a silk purse that hung from the wire and it contained the winnings. So if you ever get a trivia quiz about the origins of the purse, you know exactly now how that would come about. So together they did very well with their farm, but John would die very suddenly from a stroke at the age of 66. Everything came to Josephine. But she's stepping into a man's will by taking on this stock farm, becoming involved in breeding of horses. Totally unheard of for a woman to be doing something like that. But she would become very successful. She was not allowed to be in the jockey club as a woman, but she would go down to the Phoenix Hotel where all the horsemen of Lexington would gather, and she would certainly hold her own, down there. She could discuss horses, breeding with the best of them, and she would even sometimes join in their poker games. She also would have her own catalogues, and Cameron's going to show you one of her catalogues there because they were praised for being very different. She would often tell little stories about the horses inside, many of which she'd got from John's father, Henry Clay, because they had inherited some of his horses. And she did very well as a breeder. But by 1903, she has cataracts, she's losing her sight, ill health. She will sell up. But she would not sell all her horses. She would keep some of them more as pets, and she could be often seen out on the grounds of her Ashland wearing this straw hat that the horses would nibble at. She would often say, I never spend more than a quarter on these hats because the horses are in them immediately. And Cameron's showing you a picture of her out there. But she wouldn't retire completely from life, even though she broke her hip, and it did keep her from doing a lot of things physically, because she would start to write novels. And it's interesting, these novels are fairly difficult to read. They're quite stilted, they're very Victorian, but they all have very strong female characters. And some of them actually come from her own life. In fact, the one that maybe Cameron is showing you now is Uncle Phil. And in Uncle Phil, there is a story about a woman called Geraldine Southampton that's presumably meant to be Jo, where she's helping her husband who's injured in the Civil War. It's also interesting when you're looking at the catalogue and the books, is that although she has written them, had them published, you don't see her name there. You don't see Mrs. Josephine Clay there. You see her husband's name, Mrs. John M. Clay. The world wasn't quite ready at that point in time for her name to be on there. But she would become involved in many of the causes of the early part of the 1900s, particularly the suffrage movement. She would stay up to date with current events. She would actually knit socks for some of the soldiers in the First World War. But her days of being able to travel were over. She, when she wrote her will though, would pass on to her two daughters. Her Nettie, her middle daughter, had died just after she had got married. So her two daughters and their children, she would make sure she would pass that independent spirit to them, and that paddle my own canoe ideal. And Cameron is showing you them at Ashland on Tate's Creek. In fact, Josephine is there to the right, but that looks like a straw hat on. And two of her daughters, and the husbands are sitting, you might notice. The men are sitting, the women are standing. And then some of her grandchildren are sitting in the front. But her will specifically says that she leaves everything to her daughters, and their husbands are not to have anything to do with any control over her estate. So, as I say, she made sure that that independent spirit was passed on down through the generations. And she empowered those women to be able to have far more control over their lives. Now, Josephine would die at the age of 84 in March of 1920. So she would be there to see Kentucky ratify the 19th Amendment. But sadly, she would not be there to vote in that November. But I think she would agree that she had left a legacy behind of having a spirit that most women had no control over their lives. She made a change, and she really, as Cameron said, bridges that gap between somebody like Lucretia, which, because of society's norms, were not permitted to take part in most things, right up to Madge and Nettie, the great granddaughters of the Clays, who did have some power. And they also had power to make changes. But she certainly was a person that made a difference. So if we have any questions, you can put them through to Cameron. We would say that we are doing the women's tour where Josephine is involved in that just for the month of August, but then possibly we could do private tours as well. So if I can't answer them, Eric's listening. Eric will remember every date and everything and help me out.
Thank you so much, Sue. This is so cool. Like Sue said, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the comments. We'll stay on here for a couple more minutes and make sure that we answer any questions that you have. Good morning to, I see Lynn Cruz is watching, Gaynell Warren and Julie Sumner, who are my grandmother and my mother. Mike McDonald, the Hemsters say hi, Sue. The Kentucky Hemsters say hi, Sue. Lynn says that you did an excellent job. Good morning, Mike McDonald. Thank you all so much for watching. We would love for you to include any questions you have. Sue, I'm just so inspired by Josephine's story. Thank you so much for sharing it. I'm really tempted to kind of look more into it. I know that you mentioned that there is a book about Josephine, written by Henry Clay Simpson Jr. Now,
yes, that's Clay. Yes, he uses Clay.
So that is a descendant of Josephine's?
He's a great
The
grandson.
great grandson. Okay, so if you missed the beginning of the talks, you can kind of go back and listen. But Sue talks a little bit about how Clay found a scrapbook of his great-grandmother's and wrote this book kind of based on her life. Yes, during the ice storm. So that's kind of a nice idea. If you're stuck at home, just look through all of your old family things and write a book about it. You can actually purchase this book in the museum store here at Ashland, which is open every day that we're open in the Keeper's Cottage. So Sue, I don't see any questions right now, but you're getting lots of good feedback saying enjoyable, very interesting, excellent talk and tour. So Sue, thank you so much. Thanks for the work that you do here at Ashland and for sharing Josephine's story. Thank you all so much for watching. Goodbye.